It always starts quietly, not with the roar of engines or the flash of artillery, but with a feeling subtle, persistent, impossible to name. A tension in the air, as if the world were holding its breath without knowing why. Many Americans have felt it in recent years. The uncanny sense that reality itself is splitting, that neighbors no longer see the same world, that the foundations beneath everyday life have begun to shift in ways no one can quite explain. And it is here, in this strange unease, that Edgar Cayce's most haunting prophecy begins to take shape. Long before smartphones, before information wars, before polarized networks reshaped public consciousness, Cayce spoke of a future conflict unlike any in human history. He did not warn of a world consumed by fire, nor of nations collapsing under armies. Instead, he described something far more intimate, a war waged through human awareness itself, a silent struggle fought not across borders, but inside the private chambers of the mind. He said there would come a time when humanity would be forced to choose between two frequencies, one rooted in fear and fragmentation, and the other in unity, compassion and awakening. And he insisted that this sorting would not be metaphorical, it would be real, decisive, and global. What startled researchers in later decades was how plainly he spoke of this divide. He described it as a cleaving of consciousness, a moment when people living side by side would perceive utterly different versions of the same world, not because of politics, not because of culture, but because of the spiritual resonance they carried within them. To Cayce, every thought emitted a tone. Every belief, every emotion, every act of kindness or cruelty shaped the frequency of a person's soul. And those frequencies, he warned, would soon begin to align with one of two great currents flowing through the world currents. He called the forces of light and the forces of materialism. For decades, this sounded poetic but distant, as if meant for some far-off era. But look around now. The divide is no longer theoretical. Conversations break apart families. Friends drift into different realities defined not by shared facts, but by inner resonance. One group moves toward compassion, empathy, and interconnectedness. The other contracts into fear, survivalism, and distrust. Cayce foresaw this long before our screens became battlegrounds for attention. Long before algorithms replaced dialogue, long before information itself fragmented into 1,000 contradictory shards. And he insisted it would happen first in America. To him, America was not merely a nation. It was a symbolic stage where humanity would enact the opening chapter of the consciousness war. He believed America carried a spiritual responsibility, its diversity, its freedoms, its influence, all acting as catalysts for a global awakening. But with that potential, he warned, came immense danger, because the same land that could become a beacon could also become the fault line where the first cracks of global division appeared. In one of his most striking readings from the 1940s, delivered when the country was preoccupied with the visible horrors of World War II, Cayce told his assistants that the battles then shaking Europe and the Pacific were merely the outer shadows of a far greater conflict still to come. He said the real war, the decisive war, would arrive when humanity no longer recognized its own inner compass and became vulnerable to forces seeking to manipulate collective thought. He spoke of a season when truth would feel unstable, when perception would fracture, when people would cling desperately to identities constructed around fear. And he added a cryptic note: this will be the war that sorts the souls of men. No armies, no impetus, just self stripped down, exposed, forced to choose which frequency they would inhabit. The chilling part wasn't the prophecy itself. It was how Cayce described the mechanics of this war. He insisted the forces of darkness would not act through violence, but through slow, subtle corrosion. They would encourage division. They would distort perception. They would amplify fear until it became habitual. And they would do it, he said, in ways people would not recognize until it was nearly too late. To Cayce, fear was not an emotion. It was an infection, a spiritual toxin. And once absorbed, it lowered the frequency of the soul, pulling it toward material obsession and spiritual blindness. On the other side were the forces of awakening, quiet, steady, persistent. They worked through clarity, compassion, truthfulness, patience. They elevated consciousness not by force, but by resonance. And in this invisible battlefield, every thought became an act of alignment. Every moment of stillness, every gesture of kindness, every decision made from the heart rather than the ego became a declaration of allegiance to the light. Cayce said humanity would not recognize this war at first because it would be fought through ordinary days, through how people reacted to news, to loss, to change, to one another. But eventually, he warned, the divide would become undeniable. There will come a time, he said, when two men standing side by side will walk upon different paths, though their feet share the same ground. And he emphasized that this divide would intensify after 2026. The threshold of a planetary cycle, he believed, would test the moral and spiritual strength of every nation. What makes his words feel eerie now is not their poetry, but their accuracy, the sense of living in parallel realities. The confusion, the mistrust, the way small disagreements can fracture entire communities. To Cayce, these were not symptoms of cultural decay. They were symptoms of the consciousness war reaching maturity. Yet he also offered something few prophets do: reassurance. He said the light had already prevailed in the higher planes. The war on Earth was not about determining the outcome, only about determining who would align with it. Every soul, he insisted, was being offered a choice. And because free will is sacred, the choice could not be forced, only revealed. This was why, in his visions, America after 2026 stood not on the edge of ruin but on the edge of transformation. Crisis, he taught, is the crucible of awakening. Division is the catalyst for discernment. And the collapse of old systems is not punishment, but preparation for something new. If his prophecy is correct, and countless events now echo his warnings, then what we are witnessing is not the end of America, but the beginning of the sorting. Not a moment of doom, but a moment of unveiling. A time when each person discovers which frequency they have long carried, perhaps without realizing it. And somewhere, beneath the noise of this divided era, something ancient and luminous is stirring, a gentling, inviting, waiting for those who can still hear the tone beneath the chaos. It's strange how seamlessly a prophecy can slip into daily life without anyone noticing. You wake up, reach for a glowing rectangle before you even take a breath. Scroll through the noise of 1,000 voices you don't know. Absorb emotions that aren't yours, and call it routine, common, harmless. But what if the routine itself was the prophecy? What if the very object you hold each morning is the fulfillment of a warning spoken before your grandparents were born? Edgar Cayce described it with unsettling precision in a reading recorded in the final year of his life, his voice weakening, his breath shallow. He spoke of a future age when the forces of materialism will fashion instruments carried upon the person, delivering impressions to the mind that bend the will, distort the senses, and bind the soul to the lower vibrations. At the time, listeners thought he was referring to radios or telegraphs. They smiled politely. Technology was primitive, then wires, static, bulky equipment, nothing that could be hidden in a pocket, let alone held in a palm like a talisman. And yet he insisted the device would be small, pervasive, and more addictive than any substance humanity had yet discovered. When his stenographer, Gladys Davis, asked him whether these devices would be used for communication, Cayce paused. Then he said something that would haunt her for decades. Not communication, conditioning. Only now, as millions carry their screens like extensions of their bodies, does his meaning begin to unfold. He said that technology in this era would not simply inform, it would influence, it would agitate. It would subtly shape the emotional currents of entire populations. And in shaping emotion, it would shape destiny. Because Cayce understood something scientists would not explore until the 21st century. Consciousness is the most valuable resource on Earth. It determines behavior. Behavior shapes culture. Culture influences history. Whoever controls consciousness controls the future. And consciousness, he warned, is most vulnerable when it is distracted. Look closely at these devices that have become so ordinary, they are nearly invisible. They hum softly with notifications engineered to ignite anxiety before you can articulate why. They feed you fragments of information designed not to enlighten you but to keep you scrolling longer, deeper, further away from the world that actually surrounds you. Cayce foresaw this, a future where humanity would be so inundated with information that truth would become indistinguishable from noise, where people would know more about strangers online than about their own inner landscapes. And the most chilling point, he said these technologies would not evolve by accident, that behind them would be forces seeking dominion not over nations, but over the currents of the mind, forces that thrive on distraction, forces that amplify fear, forces that pull consciousness away from its natural ability to ascend. To Cayce, this was not a conspiracy in the political sense, it was a spiritual mechanism, a distortion field created by materialism itself. The more people consumed, the less they remembered who they were. He predicted that by the early 21st century, millions would be so absorbed by these devices that they would forget how to be still, forget how to listen inwardly, forget the sensation of their own intuition. He warned that constant stimulation would act as a spiritual anesthetic, numbing the very senses required for discernment in the age he saw coming after 2026. The mind, he said, cannot hear the whisper of the divine when it is filled with the clamor of the world. And yet, he also saw a paradox, one that defines this era with uncanny accuracy. The same devices that lower consciousness can elevate it. The same networks that spread fear can spark awakening. The same technology that carries the imprint of materialism can, when used with intention, bridge souls across continents. Cayce said technology was neutral. It is the frequency behind its use that determines its spiritual effect. If used mindlessly, it becomes a tool of spiritual erosion. If used consciously, it becomes a catalyst for collective transformation. But most, he warned, would not use it consciously. He described a generation that would rise after 2026, born into a digital world, shaped by invisible algorithms, conditioned to seek validation from screens, rather than from the quiet truth within themselves. He said many of them would struggle to recognize their own emotions unless they were reflected back to them through these devices, that their identities would become fragmented, shaped by shifting expectations and viral narratives rather than by the steady heartbeat of the soul. When he spoke these words in the 1940s, no one imagined such a future. But now, more than ever, you can see it unfolding. Look at the crowds with eyes fixed downward, unaware of the world around them. Look at the way uncertainty spreads faster than facts. The way fear multiplies through comment sections, the way outrage becomes a sport. Look at how easy it is to manipulate an entire population by controlling the rhythm of their attention. Cayce predicted this. He said the war of consciousness would be waged not through weapons, but through the subtle imprisoning of awareness. And yet, amid this foreboding vision, he offered an unexpected reassurance. The soul cannot be owned. It can be influenced, conditioned, misled, but never conquered. He believed that the very pressures created by this technological age would ultimately lead many to reclaim their awareness, that the overstimulation would force a breaking point, that people would begin to feel the emptiness beneath the constant noise, the longing for something real, something ancient, something unshakable. He said millions would awaken not because they sought enlightenment, but because they could no longer bear the weight of unreality. They would begin turning inward, seeking silence, seeking authenticity, seeking connection, not mediated by screens but forged through presence. And from that inner turning, a new kind of spiritual resilience would emerge. But first, he warned, the world must pass through a threshold. After 2026, he said, the conditioning power of these devices would reach its peak. People would begin choosing, often unconsciously, whether to remain tethered to the lower vibrations of fear-driven content or to rise above it and reclaim sovereignty over their inner state. This, Cayce believed, would be one of the defining features of America's post-2026 transformation. A society learning to disengage from the noise that has shaped it for decades. A culture slowly remembering the power of stillness. A generation discovering that awareness is not something given or taken, it is something chosen. And so, the war of consciousness unfolds not on battlefields, but in pockets, purses, nights, and palms through the simple question each person faces countless times a day. What will I give my attention to? Cayce said this question, more than any other, determines the frequency of the soul. And in a world designed to drown out silence, choosing awareness becomes the first act of revolution. If Cayce was right, the echoes of his warnings now pulse through every corner of modern life, then the war of consciousness unfolding in America does not begin on the outside. It begins where people least expect it, in the places they trust most. The hospital, the classroom, the private chambers of the mind. Three arenas so ordinary, so woven into the rhythm of society, that few ever imagined they could be the front lines of a spiritual conflict. Yet Cayce insisted they were, and he warned that whoever controlled these three realms would shape the destiny of an entire generation. He said the first battleground would be health, because health determines not only the strength of the body, but the clarity of the spirit that inhabits it. Long before holistic healing became a buzzword, Cayce spoke of the body as an instrument, a tuning fork, one capable of vibrating at frequencies that connect directly to higher consciousness. He believed illness didn't simply disrupt the body, it disrupted the soul's ability to perceive truth, and he warned that a time would come when natural healing methods, those rooted in energy, intention, and the unseen intelligence of the body, would be dismissed, belittled, or suppressed. He said powerful interests would arise, interests that profit from sickness rather than from wellness, that promote remedies disconnected from the essence of the human being. And he foresaw a nation where health would be defined not by vitality but by dependency and pills, on procedures, on external authorities who treat symptoms rather than causes. Yet he said something else, something almost impossible to imagine during his era, that eventually, a resurgence would come, a return to understanding the body as both physical and spiritual, a movement led not by institutions but by individuals, people who rediscover what ancient healers always knew. In many ways, this renewal has already begun. Look at the millions turning toward meditation, energy work, breath practices. Look at the rising distrust of processed cures and the search for meaning behind symptoms. Look at the countless stories of people healing through practices the mainstream once mocked. Stories like Sarah Thompson's, a woman from Virginia who, in the 1970s, turned to Cayce's teachings after doctors gave her 3 months to live. She began daily meditation and prayer not as desperation but as alignment, and, within months, her cancer vanished. Her physicians had no explanation, but she insisted it was simple. She remembered who she was. Cayce used her case to teach something profound. The body reflects the mind, and the mind reflects the soul. You cannot heal one without touching all three. In the war of consciousness, the people who remember this become immune to the low vibrations that weaken both body and spirit. The second battleground, he said, would be education. Not the education of facts and formulas, but the education of identity. Cayce warned of a future where classrooms would drift further and further away from acknowledging the soul, where materialism not as greed, but as a worldview would dominate schools, universities, and institutions that shape young minds. He said this worldview would teach children that they are nothing more than flesh, that consciousness is an accident of biology, that purpose is chosen rather than revealed, and that the unseen world does not exist. To Cayce, This was the greatest danger, because a child who believes they are only a body is a child unprepared for the spiritual turbulence he foresaw after 2026. He said institutions would become skeptical of anything, invisible intuition, inspiration, inner knowing until generations grew up disconnected from their true nature. He even warned that knowledge would become an idol, replacing wisdom, and that society would mistake information for insight. Yet even as this wave of materialist education spread, he said another movement would rise beneath it, small at first, scattered, easy to overlook. Groups of teachers, guides, and parents who remember that children are not blank slates, but ancient souls. These individuals would bring back the oldest form of education on earth, remembering, teaching children to listen to their inner voice, to trust their dreams, to understand that their purpose was chosen long before birth, and these children, he said, would grow into leaders of a new era not through authority, but through resonance. They would carry a clarity that could cut through the noise of an entire culture. The third battleground Cayce described was the most intimate and the most perilous. Inner consciousness, he said the greatest danger of the coming age would not be war, or disease, or even technological manipulation. It would be the slow erosion of the inner life. A world where people become strangers to themselves, where thoughts are influenced by currents they do not perceive, where fear becomes a habit rather than a response. To illustrate this, Cayce once said that every thought a person entertains is a seed, one that grows roots into the fabric of their destiny. He said that in this era, the forces of darkness would not act loudly. They would encourage negative thinking, self-doubt. He said these states of mind lower the vibrational field of the soul, making it susceptible to manipulation. And because thoughts generate resonance, each negative thought is like a vote cast for the world one does not want. But the opposite is also true. Every act of patience, every moment of compassion, every effort to choose understanding over judgment elevates the frequency of the soul. Cayce believed this was the true measure of destiny. Not action, but resonance. Not belief, but alignment. He illustrated this through the story of Robert Martinez, a man from Phoenix who spiraled into depression and addiction in the early 1980s. Feeling lost, he turned to Cayce's readings in desperation. His first step was simple, a daily practice of 20 minutes of stillness. He described it as torture at first. His mind, used to noise, to stimulation, to distraction, rebelled, but he persisted. Within weeks, the darkness began to lift. Within months, he felt something he could not explain. Quiet presence guiding him, revealing insights and images of the future. His addiction faded, his depression dissolved, and he eventually opened a healing center that helped thousands rediscover their purpose. Cayce used stories like Robert S. to reveal a truth modern culture often forgets. The greatest battle a person will ever fight is the battle to stay awake inside themselves. To not surrender awareness to fear. To not allow distraction to dissolve purpose. To not allow the noise of the world to drown out the whisper of the soul. These three battlegrounds, health, education, inner consciousness, are not separate arenas. They are mirrors. What weakens one, weakens the others, and what strengthens one, strengthens them all. Cayce said America's future after 2026 would depend not on laws or leaders, but on how many individuals reclaim sovereignty over their bodies, their learning, and their inner lives. Because in the end, he said, the war of consciousness is not between nations or ideologies. It is between forgetfulness and remembrance, between illusion and clarity, between the self that fears and the self that knows. And somewhere within each decision, each reaction, each quiet moment of awareness, the soul casts its vote. There is a moment in Cayce's readings so audacious, so unsettling, that even the researchers who preserved his work hesitated to interpret it. In several visions always delivered in a trance state, always spoken with a solemnity that left the room unnervingly still, Cayce claimed that the souls who once lived in Atlantis would return in the era of humanity's great divide, not as mythic figures rising from the sea, not as supernatural beings descending from the sky, but as ordinary people reborn into this world, scattered across America and the broader earth, their memories buried, but their tendencies unmistakable. To Cayce, Atlantis was not a fantasy. It was a civilization that rose to unimaginable spiritual and technological heights, then collapsed under the weight of its own pride and misuse of power. He said the Atlanteans were divided into two groups, the followers of the law of one, who revered unity and harmony, and the sons of Belial, who mastered energy but wielded it for control. Their ancient conflict, he insisted, did not disappear when their continents sank beneath the waves. It traveled forward, carried in the souls that reincarnated throughout the centuries, destined to meet again in a future moment when humanity would face a similar crossroads. That moment, he warned, would arrive after 2026. Cayce described clusters of souls returning with dormant talents, intuition sharper than reason, creativity that bordered on otherworldly, insights that seemed like memory rather than invention. He said these individuals would feel restless in ordinary life, drawn to knowledge they had never studied, pulled toward mysteries they could not explain. Many would feel misunderstood in their youth, as if searching for something they once knew but had forgotten. And as the world moved deeper into the consciousness war, these Atlantean souls would begin to awaken. Their talents would sharpen. Their inner knowing would intensify. Their sense of mission, though unspoken, would become undeniable. But Cayce added a warning so grave that the stenographers underlined it in their transcripts. Those same souls would also carry the shadows that destroyed Atlantis. Pride, impatience, desire for influence, a tendency to misuse spiritual gifts for personal validation rather than for service. He said the Atlanteans who return in this age would be tested not by external enemies, but by the echo of their own ancient mistakes. Some would rise, some would fall, and their choice would influence the trajectory of whole nations. In the years before his death, Cayce often referenced this collision of past and present. He spoke of a great gathering of souls reincarnating into North America between the late 20th and early 21st century souls who once held roles of leadership, invention, and spiritual guidance in Atlantis. Their presence, he said, would explain why so many people in this era feel an unplaceable nostalgia, a longing for a lost world they cannot name, a sense of having lived through a catastrophe that shaped their deepest fears and hopes. One of the stories Cayce used to illustrate this phenomenon involved a woman named Helena Brewer. Born in Ohio in 1962, from childhood, Helena described dreams of crystal temples, floating structures, and energy fields that responded to thoughts. She drew diagrams of machines she could not possibly have seen, devices powered by light and sound. Her parents dismissed it as imagination, but Cayce's foundation recognized the patterns. Helena carried memories, not conscious ones, but impressions of an ancient life. As she grew older, her intuitive abilities sharpened. She became a healer without ever studying healing. She could sense illness in others simply by standing near them. But with her gifts came a shadwa, frustration with the limitations of the physical world, a subtle arrogance, an impatience that strained relationships. She struggled not with external challenges, but with the remnants of a past self that still believed power should be effortless. Cayce said Helena's life was a microcosm of what many would experience after 2026. The return of Atlantean souls was not a mythic prophecy, it was a spiritual inheritance, resurfacing at a critical moment. And as the world entered a period of upheaval, these souls would feel the turbulence more acutely than others. Their senses would heighten, their dreams would intensify, their intuition would surge. Some would remember fragments of their past lives, glimpses, symbols, sensations. Others would simply feel propelled by a purpose they could not articulate. Yet with awakening comes responsibility. Cayce warned that the Atlantean souls would once again split into two groups, the same branches that divided their ancient civilization. Those aligned with unity, compassion, and service would become beacons during the global transition, helping guide communities through uncertainty. But those who succumbed to pride, fear, and desire for influence would echo the same patterns that brought Atlantis to ruin. Their brilliance could become manipulation. Their intuition could become obsession. Their power could become control. He said America would become one of the central stages for this drama, not because of politics or population, but because the nation holds an unusually dense concentration of Atlantean souls. Its innovation, its restlessness, its attraction to mystery and reinvention, all of these, he said, are signatures of a culture seeded by ancient memories. And after 2026, the tension between awakening and collapse would intensify. Cayce described it like a tuning fork struck in the cosmic dark, a vibration that would activate dormant traits in these reincarnated souls. Some would step into leadership roles they were born for, helping humanity navigate the transition into higher consciousness. Others would unravel, overpowered by their own unresolved past, echoing the chaos that once swallowed their ancient home. Cayce insisted this was not fate but choice. The return of the Atlanteans was not a prediction of doom, but an invitation, a second chance, a moment for ancient souls to rewrite the story that ended in destruction long ago. And he warned that this inner battle between memory and mastery, pride and purpose, would shape America's future more profoundly than any political or economic event. The reason, he said, is simple. When powerful souls awaken, the world around them shifts. Their choices ripple outward. Their alignment becomes a signal for others. And in an era defined by frequency, the resonance of even a few individuals can alter the trajectory of millions. This is why, he said, the years after 2026 would feel uncanny, charged, fated, because the past is returning not as myth, not as metaphor, but as people. And the world is entering the same choice Atlantis once faced, rise or fall. But this time, Cayce insisted, the outcome is not predetermined. It depends on whether these returning souls remember why they came back. There is a kind of silence that arrives before great turning points, an almost imperceptible pause in the rhythm of the world, like the stillness before a storm or the breath taken before a revelation. Cayce said humanity would enter such a silence after 2026, not a literal quiet, not the absence of sound, but a spiritual hush, a moment when the noise of the old world begins to lose its authority, and something deeper, older, and infinitely more luminous begins to rise beneath it. A moment when the soul feels the truth long before the mind understands it. He called this moment the sorting, not judgment, not punishment, not division imposed from above, but an organic unfolding and natural consequence of frequency. He said every soul carries a resonance, a tone shaped by years of choices, habits, thoughts, and intentions. And in the era after 2026, these tones would become unmistakable, aligning people with environments, communities, and experiences that match their inner state. In one reading, he described it this way: as the earth ascends, like calls to like. Light gravitates toward light. Fear gravitates toward fear. People begin to drift gently, subtly toward the futures they have long been building within themselves. To Cayce, America's transformation after 2026 would not be the result of elections or laws. It would emerge from this spiritual sorting. He said the nation would divide along lines invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the soul. Not political lines, not cultural lines, lines of consciousness. Some people would feel drawn to simplicity, to community, to authenticity, to compassion. They would find themselves surrounded by others who share these values, as if guided by an unseen magnet. These individuals would form the early architecture of what Cayce called the New Earth consciousness, a way of living that emphasizes coherence over conflict, intuition over impulse, and cooperation over competition. Others would move deeper into fear, clinging to material security, control, and identity. Their worlds would grow louder, more chaotic, more unstable, not as punishment, but because their inner frequency harmonizes with environments that challenge them to confront the shadows they have avoided. Cayce insisted this was not about good people and bad people, it was about alignment, souls choosing the lessons they need, souls gravitating toward the futures they resonate with. The sorting, he said, simply reveals what has always been there. And beneath this shifting, America would begin to take on a new shape, not outwardly at first, but inwardly. The early signs would appear in the years after 2026. A growing interest in spiritual education, a resurgence of natural healing, a collective exhaustion with division, a yearning for meaning that no institution can provide. These changes would look small on the surface, but they would signal a profound reorientation, like roots changing direction underground, long before the tree above them shifts. Cayce said America carries a karmic responsibility, not to lead the world politically, but spiritually. Its diversity, its restlessness, its contradictions make it the ideal crucible for the consciousness transformation he described. And in the emerging New Earth timeline, he said America would eventually become a center of healing and spiritual innovation, if enough souls choose the higher frequency. This "if" is the heart of the sorting. He said the years surrounding 2030 would feel unsettled, electrically charged, as if entire realities were brushing past one another. People would sense futures collapsing and emerging simultaneously. Old systems, financial, educational, political, would weaken, not through catastrophe, but through irrelevance. Institutions built on fear would lose influence. Those rooted in service would quietly grow stronger. The most striking part of Cayce's prophecy is the gentleness of it. The transformation is not forced, not violent, not catastrophic. It is subtle, like dawn rising through fog. It begins with inner decisions so small they almost go unnoticed, choosing silence over noise, choosing kindness over reaction, choosing truth over convenience, choosing awareness over distraction. These choices shift the tone of the soul, and when enough souls shift, the world follows. He described children born after 2030 as souls of remembrance, individuals who come with heightened intuition, empathy, and perception. He said they would bridge the gap between dimensions, sensing what adults have forgotten. Many would recall glimpses of past lives. Some would communicate telepathically with startling ease. Their presence would gently force older generations to reconsider the limits of reality itself. And as these children grow, they begin to shape the culture. Their clarity cuts through deception. Their sensitivity exposes what no longer works. Their presence opens doors that have been closed for centuries. America, Cayce said, would slowly soften, not in strength, but in spirit. It would become less driven by dominance and more by purpose, less by competition and more by creativity, less by fear and more by coherence. Yet even in this hopeful vision, Cayce emphasized one truth again and again: the sorting is not collective, it is individual. Nations rise when individuals rise. Societies transform when souls transform. And the most important work of the coming era happens not in governments or institutions, but in kitchens, bedrooms, quiet walks, moments of inward listening. In the invisible spaces where consciousness is shaped. This is why, in his later readings, Cayce often spoke directly to the individual. Your task, he said, is not to change the world. Your task is to become the truth of your own being. Only then, he insisted, does the world change. And so, as the noise of the old world continues to fracture, as crises rise and fall like tidal waves, as uncertainty presses in from all directions, something else is happening beneath the surface. Something quiet, steady, luminous. The tone of the earth is rising. And with each passing year, the souls who align with that rising frequency begin to feel more at home, more guided, more certain of their path. Others feel the opposite. disoriented, untethered, pulled between identities, struggling to hold on to the structures that once defined them. For them, the sorting is not punishment, it is invitation, a call to step out of fear, a reminder that awakening is still possible at any moment. In the end, Cayce said, the sorting leads not to division but to clarity, not to chaos but to coherence. It is the moment when humanity learns that consciousness is the true frontier, that the soul is the true compass, and that the future is shaped not by prediction but by resonance. And so, as America enters its post-2026 destiny, the noise may continue, the conflicts may echo, the old systems may tremble, but beneath them, quietly, the new world is already forming. It forms in every person who chooses awareness, in every heart that opens despite the fear, in every soul that remembers the ancient truth whispered at the beginning of all things. Light is not something one follows, it is something one becomes. And when enough souls remember, the new earth emerges from within the old, not with thunder, but with a dawn so soft, so steady, that it feels less like a beginning and more like a homecoming.